Hello and welcome to this Neurotech investor webinar discussing three key announcements for the company that were lodged with the ASX this morning regarding its phase 2/3 autism trial results, phase 1/2 Rett syndrome top-line results, and a $10 million capital raising. All participants are in a listen-only mode. There'll be a presentation first that will last for approximately 30 minutes, followed by a Q&A. If you have a question you'd like to submit, please feel free to type it in using the Q&A function within Zoom. And please note this session is being recorded. On behalf of Neurotech today, we have the Executive Director, Dr. Thomas Duthy. I'll now hand it over to Tom. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks everyone for joining today's informative webinar. We are absolutely delighted to be presenting to you very strong clinical data across two very difficult to treat pediatric neurological disorders in autism spectrum disorder, ASD, and Rett syndrome. So it's a great day for the company. Equally so, it's a fantastic day for these young children, their caregivers, and we sincerely thank our clinical investigators, Professor Fay and Associate Professor Carolyn Ellaway, on delivering these amazing outcomes in these very special pediatric patients. It's our standard disclaimer for today's call. Just want everyone on the call to realise as we start to the disclosure process here for autism, that the overarching goal in autism is really to improve the core deficit that exists in these children as it relates to their socialisation, communication, and minimising the impact of their restricted behaviours. And the overarching effect of that is actually to help these children develop greater functional skills and independence. So in some respects, we are seeking as a treatment goal to unlock the child from themselves. And the patients we are treating under these trials or have treated are level 2 and level 3 autistic children requiring substantial to very substantial care. So they are what we would say are quite ill, and therefore the impacts of this therapy, NTI-164 today, are all the more encouraging for future commercialisation and approvals. Just a quick background for those who are less familiar with autism. We, as an overarching scientific principle, and everything we do is dedicated to paediatric neurological indications where there is persistent, progressive, or proliferative neuroinflammation. The reason we do that is because our preclinical data on NTI-164, which is a full spectrum or broad spectrum oral cannabinoid drug therapy, the preclinical development we've undertaken shows that we have a very strong anti-neuroinflammatory effect, and we also have a very strong neuroprotective and neuroproliferative effect of NTI-164 in vitro. So autism spectrum disorder is a serious neuroinflammatory disorder, and although there are a lot of patients and the prevalence is only growing, and I'll give you a little bit of data on that in a moment, there are just two approved drugs, risperidone and aripiprazole, and these drugs have limited utilization. And so the market size relative to the number of patients is actually reasonably small because of the lack of enthusiasm or the lack of clinician willingness to prescribe these drugs, which essentially restrict just irritability and aggression. They do nothing to improve the child's core deficits here that I just mentioned, those core domains of socialisation and communication. And they also have reasonably strong side effects, including sedation, weight gain, and those others I've listed there. There are no FDA-approved treatments for the core symptoms of autism spectrum disorder, and therefore, as you will see, and as indicated by our lead investigator, there is a significant unmet medical need here for effective therapies and safe therapies in these children in order to improve those core symptoms. The NDIS is always a topical one, and this is a driver for the Australian taxpayer of around, well, a cost to the Australian taxpayer of around $7 billion for level 2 and level 3 autistic patients, the majority of which are children. And we have 230,000 autistic patients on the NDIS where autism is their primary diagnosis, and that's been growing about 15%. The NDIS provides, and it's an important differentiator here, the NDIS supplies support in the order of $34,000 per annum to families, and they can spend that on occupational therapy such as speech pathology, psychiatric care, psychology. The NDIS does not fund drugs. The Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, following approval from the Therapeutic Goods Administration, is the preeminent drug funding source as a government payer, and that is the pathway for NTI 164. However, as I think I can show you today, NTI 164 has such a profound difference, or has shown such a profound difference in these children. We can't help but think that a child that ultimately receives this intervention may require less of these support services from the NDIS, and therefore has the potential to be a tax-effective and cost-bearing intervention in Australia for autism. This slide just highlights the pathway and why we initiated this phase 2/3 clinical trial in Australia. We had moved our strategy at Neurotech to really focus in on those strengths I mentioned, which are pediatric patients with that persistent neuroinflammatory effect. And we had good data. So it's important to know that we didn't go into this trial not knowing that NTI 164 held really substantial promise. However, in the earlier studies, it was just an administration in what's called a single arm study. So both the patients and the doctor knew they were receiving NTI 164, and we now have over 90 weeks of consistent safety and efficacy benefits in those initial patients. And therefore, on a scientific basis, it made much sense to us to prove that clinical observation we'd seen through a far more rigorous placebo-controlled double-blinded clinical trial. This slide highlights what we call the design, albeit it's a little complex on the right-hand side. The important point to note here is the primary endpoint was the difference between NTI 164 and placebo with oral daily treatment of these children randomized in a one-to-one fashion where both the doctor and the patient was blinded, so that's a double-blind study. And the primary endpoint was something called clinical global impression, severity of illness, so CGI-S, which I'll come to. And we had a number of key secondary endpoints we were also interested in. Vineland-3, clinical global impression, social responsiveness scale, safety, and ADAMS. ADAMS is one of the endpoints that is currently not available, requiring more analysis. However, I'm absolutely delighted to let all of you know, as you've seen in the announcements, that not only did we meet the primary endpoint, we met it very significantly. And although the trial wasn't powered statistically to show a difference in those blue highlighted secondary endpoints, for those clinical measures, not safety, we saw a very significant improvement in those three important measures. Those of you who look at clinical trials will note that you want to remove bias in the trial from the outset. So what you want to do as a clinical investigator or as a contract research organisation overseeing the trial is to make sure there is balance between the active arm, NTI 164, and the placebo arm. So in this particular case, which is a little bit different in how you think about it, but you want the probability or the p-value to be over 0.05. So in other words, you do not want the two groups to show a statistically significant difference at their baseline scores, because that can introduce some degree of bias into the clinical outcome. Certainly a well-discharged trial on that basis. There was no statistical difference between the groups, although Neurotech notes that there were a slightly higher proportion of markedly ill children in our arm of in the NTI 164 arm of the study, which slightly increased their severity at baseline. But as I said, it wasn't statistically significant in difference to placebo, as the p-value was 0.1, i.e. greater than 0.05. This is the mathematical summary of the efficacy measures. I'll come to the contextualized effect, and pictures of exactly what that looks like to make it a bit more digestible. But 4 out of 4 ticks here. And the reason it's 4 out of 4 ticks is because we showed a significant treatment effect. That is, the intervention of using NTI 164 improved these children relative to the placebo. And I'll just quickly explain something here to those less familiar with statistical parlance. P-values of less than 0.05 are almost universally accepted. In fact, they are universally accepted as being as being statistically significant data, i.e. Less than 0.05 or 5% chance it was due to chance alone. So here you can see that the primary endpoint, there was less than a 0.1% chance that this was a fluke. And something called the treatment effect, which again, I've mentioned will be contextualized shortly, was very significant, of minus 1.65, minus being a good thing. Clinicians who treat autistic children, who use this clinician tool, are typically looking for an improvement of minus 0.5 as clinically meaningful. The reason the data was so strong is because we powered this study to show a minus 0.9 difference. So we beat our own trial design, if you like, which made the result even more compelling. The 95% CI is again a very bland statistical, not bland, but a statistical measure that basically means if we were to repeat this clinical trial 100 times, 95 out of 100 times, the true effect would lie between minus 2.3 and minus 1. So that's a tight range. And what that means is that at worst, this improves scale point in 95 out of 100 times by 1. Similarly with Vineland, CGI-I, and SRS, all statistically significant, and I'll come to those. It's always important for the lead investigator to give his or her view on what they think about the clinical results. And you can see here by Professor Michael Fay, as a clinician, he's very interested in improving these adaptive behaviours. And we've done that in a statistically and clinically meaningful manner. And he notes, as I've mentioned to you, that there are no approved treatments that actually target and improve these core symptoms in autism. So we're very, very pleased Professor Fay has put his name to these very strong clinical results. Before I come to the results in a bit more detail, it is highlighted here just how safe NTI-164 is. So over the trial, there was no serious adverse events for both NTI-164 and placebo across the entire 8 weeks of the blinded trial period. Adverse events were tolerated and manageable. And in fact, they were very small overall. And you can see here the nausea and vomiting was really no different between NTI-164 and placebo, which really convinces us now that, in fact, the formulation, which is oil, is probably what's causing the nausea and the vomiting. It's not actually the NTI-164 drug compounds in that mixture. Diarrhea, which is an interesting one in the context of Rett syndrome later on in the presentation, was 0. All other chemistry measures, kidney function, liver function, were normal. So very easy for me to conclude and study investigators to say that this has an excellent safety profile with minimal patient side effects. Looking more carefully at the endpoint CGI-S, I've used this heat map before in our phase 1 and 2 open label clinical trial, and I use it again here for simplicity because I think it elegantly shows what this trial has clearly achieved here today. And that is at baseline, day 0, overall, these children were scored markedly to severely ill. And in the placebo group, which is what you'd hope to show, there was no change between day 0 and week 8. In other words, there was no placebo effect as observed by the clinician. And the clinician, he or she, who administered these tests was blinded, if you recall. And so were the patients. And you can see a very large delta or change at week 8 with NTI-164. So this treatment effect is very substantial. Interestingly, in our phase 1/2 trial, at enrollment, day 0, the patients were less ill than what they were in this trial. And we actually continued to see a benefit for NTI-164 all the way to 32 weeks. So we continue, albeit this is the primary endpoint for unblinding with all patients now having switched to NTI-164. So they will all receive NTI-164 and they being the placebo group naturally. We will continue to collect data on this. But we've seen a very significant downstaging in these patients' illness and the severity of their illness. The second measure that I'm sharing with you today is a secondary endpoint, So again, bear in mind, the trial was not powered to show a statistical difference on any secondary endpoint disclosed here today. Clinical global impression improvement is basically a judgment that the clinician, he or she, makes of what is the effect of the intervention from day 0, assuming no change at day 0, versus, in our case, 8 weeks. You can see here once again that overall on the mathematical chart in the middle panel there at the bottom, the placebo group did not improve. They stayed basically the same. The reason they stayed the same is that 28% of patients got worse in their autistic symptoms over that 8 weeks. 29% showed no change. Interestingly, and it's inexplicable at this juncture, 39% showed some minimal improvement, and one patient was lucky enough to be much improved with an intervention of just oil. Comparing that to NTI-164, you can see what is very self-evident here. No patient got worse. So the intervention, at worst, was able to hold the patient on their clinical symptom score. So 15% of patients did not change. They didn't get worse, but they didn't change. And then of those, the difference there, circa 85%, they all improved. And what pleases me here is that if you assume the minimally improved, and you need to assume this, minimally improved are about the same as the placebo group, we were able to shift 46%, so almost half of these patients were shifted to a much improved or a very much improved status. Exceedingly pleasing result, and also highlights the consistency of that clinician battery as it relates to CGI-S as well. Vineland-3 is this very well-validated test, FDA, EMA, TGA, that looks at adaptive behaviours. So it is there to try to tease out, are you improving these core domains in an autistic patient as they relate to their communication, their daily living skills, and their socialisation. The key here is to note that what is considered by a clinician based on meta-analysis of Vineland battery tests generally is anything over 2 is clinically meaningful. So you can see here that not only were we, as a composite measure, which is inclusive of all 3, we were over 3 with our treatment effect between NTI-164 and placebo. We were statistically significant on the composite score, but even more impressively from my perspective, we were also statistically significant and clinically meaningful for those domains relating to communication. So they improved with their communication, their daily living skills, more independent, and their socialisation, interact with children or their parents, but in a more proactive and sustainable manner. This is really important for patients, their parents, and equally so clinicians. So this result is a fantastic outcome and is consistent with what we have shown before. So no surprises there. What I wanted to do here is to not bore you with all of these reference studies that have been done in risperidone particularly, but I wanted to show you that although risperidone has shown some improvements in severity and CGI-I, i.e. improvement, really the biggest deficit here, if you compare and contrast them, contrast that drug to ours, is the lack of any improvement on social interaction and communication. Risperidone effectively handcuffs the child to themselves to restrict those certain behaviours relating to irritability and aggression. Whereas NTI-164 decuffs them, uncuffs them, rips the hand ties off them, and allows them to be a more communicative social member of society by improving those core functions, which is exactly what that quote at the start of the presentation was designed to tell you. And that is a goal of treatment. So we are particularly delighted on Vineland-3. And as I mentioned, our safety is also far and away better than risperidone as a pretty clumsy, albeit approved standard for those children who have behavioural irritability and aggression. SRS, I won't spend a lot of time here. This is, again, a well-validated tool or test that looks at how autistic patients interact with their behaviours, how they maintain relationships, how they can reciprocate social interactions. Once again, a negative value being a positive in this sense, we're able to improve SRS in a statistically significant and clinically meaningful manner. The conclusions that we draw from this study are very simple. We met the primary endpoint. We've met all secondary endpoints where data has been available today. Note that they were those three: Vineland, SRS, and CGI-I. Secondly, we have shown once again that NTI-164 is a very safe formulation and intervention for these children on a once or twice a day format, depending on the child and whether the family wishes to split the dose. I think most importantly as well, there is a very huge unmet need here for these kinds of therapies, which puts us in an exceedingly good position as we look to accelerate our regulatory and commercial plans for this outstanding drug candidate. I'd just like to quickly turn to Rett syndrome. Again, Rett syndrome, there is an overarching goal with these girls. Rett syndrome is a mutational disorder on the X chromosome. It is more often than not fatal in boys. But one of the hallmarks of this genetic disorder is neuroinflammation. So 12 months ago or so, we made the scientific leap, I guess, between what in theory our drug can do and today what we've shown in practice, which again, I'm exceedingly proud of because we've been able to convince a second clinician, Associate Professor Carolyn Alloway, to try this drug in her needy children. And this was a trial that was an open label trial. So 14 girls received treatment for 12 weeks. And then we looked at the primary endpoint, which was CGI-I, which I'll come to. Rett syndrome as a disorder and as an indication has seen significant change in the last 12 months, with Neuron Pharmaceuticals and Arcadia Pharmaceuticals having received US FDA approval on the 10th of March. And what that does is it sets the benchmark for how the FDA thinks about what are the most important clinical endpoints and how they think about safety and tolerance. I've gone through this slide before, but this market is small by a number of patients, but it's very large by the dollar amount of the market. We estimate US $2 billion in annual global revenue opportunities. The reason being is as such a desperate, significant market unmet need, drug developers and their insurers are prepared to pay a significant amount for the intervention. And with DAYBUE trofinetide, the data is there in black and white. They have seen an excellent commercial start to their business for DAYBUE trofinetide, developed by Neuron, commercialized by Arcadia, and sales are forecast to be around $400 million for this calendar year. And Neuron, a company I very much admire over the last 20 years, a company that we at Neurotech would very much like to be in our journey on ASX and our commercial and regulatory plans by focusing on pediatric neurological disorders. Neuron has done a highly commendable job in extracting very significant value from their core asset, initially for Rett syndrome and thereafter for several other rare pediatric neurological disorders. What I think is going to be of interest to us, we do not have safety data here today, but I am allowing investors here to look at the safety data that we've generated for NTI-164 to date, and the safety data is reported by Neuron Arcadia's phase 3 pivotal registration trial called Lavender. And DAYBUE has exhibited in those patients some weight loss, some nausea and vomiting, around 29% of patients, and quite a high percentage of diarrhea, around 82%. As I mentioned earlier, at least in the context of our autism trial, we saw no diarrhea. We haven't reported any diarrhea in those earlier open label trial in autism, or in our other pediatric neurological disorder we're focused on developing, which is called pediatric acute onset neuropsychiatric syndrome, or PANS, and its close cousin PANDAS, which is associated with streptococcus. So we feel pretty good to date that the safety profile of NTI-164 is excellent. But as I say, we are awaiting data in Rett syndrome over the next 2 to 4 weeks. This was the design. We were pleased that all patients completed 12 weeks of treatment, i.e. there were no significant adverse events requiring them to withdraw from the study. And as some investors may have picked up in the last couple of weeks, we received human ethics approval to extend the trial for all 14 girls over 52 weeks, which is based on the judgment of the clinician, Professor Carolyn Ellaway, in close consultation with the caregivers of these girls. So today, we're very pleased to provide you with the primary endpoint, CGI-I, and we have a number of secondary endpoints which are pending, which will be available in the next 2 to 4 weeks. I guess from a financial market perspective, the one that's going to be of most interest in that secondary endpoint list there will be RSBQ, which was a co-primary endpoint for Neuron's phase 3 registration trial of Lavender. The other primary endpoint for them being exactly what we have there in the upper panel, CGI-I. Today, we reported that the trial on 14 girls, when compared to baseline, so open label trial, showed a statistically significant and clinically important change versus baseline in CGI-I of -0.3. To provide context to that result, debut trofinetide in that phase 3 data versus placebo, so not against the patient's own baseline score at the mean, showed a mean difference of -0.3 with a stronger statistical value of 0.003. Their trial enrolled, I think, close to 200 patients. As I mentioned, the data analysis interpretation is ongoing. We will have further primary endpoint analysis. I will say on that basis, what we are very interested in here at Neurotech is exactly what is in that small little byline under the darker green first comment, and that is looking at the mix of children and how they responded to therapy. So we note for debut CGI-I, 61% of patients were unchanged. This is on the CGI-I measurement. Remember, I provided that in the autism context. You've seen the chart. 61% of patients were unchanged in their Rett syndrome phase 3. 25% were minimally improved, 13% were much improved. So that data, again, is pending and will be available in 2 to 4 weeks. We've raised capital today, and I'm thankful and appreciative of our joint lead managers, MST Financial and Blue Ocean Equities, who assisted the company in completing a $10 million placement. This shows the capital structure of the business. Reconciliation of pro forma cash is based on our 31 December cash balance with some option exercises, plus the net 10 from with the placement fees, if you like, netted out. So pro forma cash of 15.5, pro forma enterprise value undiluted of 86.2. The timetable from here is the settlement is due on the 23rd, and allotment of the placement shares and a 1-for-2 unlisted option at 16 cents with a 2-year term will be on the 24th. The use of funds, we plan to direct the majority of our funds towards the next step in our clinical trial pathway for Rett, PANS, and other, where other includes what we need to do next for autism and potentially what we may be interested in as a new pediatric neurological indication moving forward. We're also dedicating some resources to the regulatory development side of things. We do need to undertake some further toxicology work in animals. From my perspective, again, we have very nice long-term human data, but global regulators want to see further sort of animal work there. And that sort of takes us up to the 10 million with the fees embedded in that. Our milestones remain pretty exciting in my view. We are 3 for 3 now in terms of the strategy as implemented in September 2022. So 3 pediatric neurological indications, each of which has shown statistically significant and clinically meaningful data, and that relates to autism, Rett, and PANS. From here, we've got the Rett data. We're looking to sit down with the Therapeutic Goods Administration on our autism data as presented today, on our full Rett data will be available in 2 to 4 weeks, and our PANS data is reported in October 2023 and then earlier this year, which showed once again these patients continue to improve after 24 weeks of NTI-164 treatment in those PANDAS children. We also have a world first, what we call metabolite-genomic data set, which is comparing or looking for what are the genes or the markers in these PANDAS children that might unlock a potential biomarker and might help us to understand a little more what is it that NTI-164 is doing in these children and what genes is it hitting or improving. In the second half, equally, we're impressed by just the sheer amount of work that we have and the outcomes we can generate here. So we are seeking to achieve orphan drug designation in Europe and the US for both Rett syndrome and PANS. And we're also expecting to commence our proof of concept phase 1/2 trial in cerebral palsy, and then that work to complete for FDA and European Medicines Agency toxicology requirements. And then based on the data, Professor Carolyn Elway hopefully will be able to present that data at the Rett syndrome meeting later in the year. I'll leave it there, Matt. I'll turn back to you. Sorry that's taken a little longer, but I thought it was important to provide as much framework for investors today as possible.
Thank you, Tom. As you've alluded to, we'll move on now to the Q&A section. Once again, these questions are based on those sent through via email and also using the Q&A function within Zoom. So again, if you have a question you'd like to submit, please feel free to do so. Tom, the first question we have is, do you anticipate children from the ASD phase 2/3 trial moving into the extension phase of the trial, and will the market continue to see data from this?
Yes, they will. And yes, they will in terms of the market will continue to see data as we've now moved into the what is the crossover period. So remember, 8-week endpoint, those children on placebo then receive NTI-164 for 8 weeks, and then all children are able to extend to 52 weeks. We don't have a data set that supports that all children under the care of Professor Fay will extend at this juncture. However, on every other trial we've conducted in autism, PANS and Rett, 100% of children have extended, and that more recently was the case for Rett. So we feel pretty confident that the data you see here in the active group, of course they will want to stay on. Why wouldn't they? The effect at the mean is significant and the safety is benign. So we just need to wait for all of those patients who were on placebo to receive NTI-164 and to elect to continue or not, as the case may be. But we're pretty confident most will.
Thank you. Next question is, will Neurotech consider any further clinical trials in paediatric patients outside of the current pipeline, and why does Neurotech focus on children as opposed to adults?
We have a stated strategy here that although these disorders can and do apply to adults, we've taken the strategic decision to work with children, and principally that is predicated on the ability to recruit patients, children, into clinical trials which aren't necessarily confounded by reams of other clinical trials that would otherwise be the case for adult patients. Secondly, we feel that we have significant clinician support for what we're doing, who are eager and willing to help their patients and very eager and willing to participate in our trials. So although there are many, many patients with autism in Australia, and there are patients who are diagnosed with Rett as children who progress and live long lives as adults, we have elected to focus on children. Now, that doesn't mean naturally that as a child turns 18 on any one of our trials, they are precluded from receiving the intervention. In fact, the opposite is true. We just apply for, and in some cases have received, ethics committee clearance to continue the treatment as adults. So our core data set, Matt, will be wholeheartedly around paediatric, i.e. less than 18 years of age. That will form the basis of all of our regulatory approvals, if successful, and therefore our label. And so purely from a balance sheet perspective, for us to invest now in replicating the pediatric work into adults, it wouldn't be a cost-effective approach for us, unfortunately. It may not be a time-effective approach for us, and the discharge of the clinical trial itself may be confounded, as I say, by larger pharmaceutical companies who like the bells and whistles of a much larger population being adults to secure clinical trials and to secure patients more obviously. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is, given the very positive data, safety profile and the cost of autism by the NDIS, do you think that this data will be of interest to the TGA with respect to an expedited registration process?
We are 24 hours into very meaningful, very exciting clinical data. So our plans, and we have sat down with the TGA in the past, we are very different to a company that seeks to provide, say, CBD oil on the market through an authorised prescriber scheme or a special access scheme. We're going the fully fledged drug development pathway here. And so for us, we are doing this work to ensure that for a regulator such as the TGA, we have a meaningful regulatory package to share with them. And we plan to share exactly this package and exactly the package that we hope to obtain in the next 2 to 4 weeks for Rett, and the package we have for PANS, to sit down with the TGA and discuss the commercial or development pathways and to seek their advice on them. Is there an expedited pathway for autism in Australia? There potentially is. There is a very unique facet to the Australian regulator TGA, and that unique facet is some drug interventions for critical needs, such as COVID vaccines, for example, have been provisionally registered, whilst the sponsor, i.e. the drug development company, obtains more longer-term clinical or safety data. So there are a number of avenues. The reason we are a bit different, I think, to most, Matt, is you probably get a lot of companies sitting up here going, we must run US trials, we must spend a lot of money, we must get the FDA's consent to do everything we do. We believe the opportunity in autism within the Australian context is so large, and the regulator, the TGA, is so engaged in what we're doing, that we feel we have a faster sporting chance to be registered here. And I'm not scared about that, because at the end of the day, there's 230,000 level 2 and level 3 children and adults, but mostly children, who receive $34,000 on average from the NDIS to essentially assist them in their daily living and assist them as autistic patients. What we're doing is intervening to reduce all that. And so I take 230,000 patients on NDIS as my target market for NTI 164, because I truly believe, based on the data we've shown today, that we can transform these children and we can transform their parents and allow them to go back to work, which, all things being equal, is highly cost effective. So the FDA work as it relates to autism is not a strategy we're employing today. We are employing that strategy and in Europe for Rett and PANS, but we're really and almost exquisitely focused for now on autism in Australia.
Thank you. The next question, there's been a few along these lines, but given the significance of today's trial results, do you think you'll receive interest from international pharma companies looking to partner with NTI for other markets around the world?
Have to see on Rett. Obviously, the full data set's not available. I would say that the data set we have today is a very strong set of results that should and could elicit a response from certain corporate entities or logos as the dissemination of this primary finding circulates through the scientific and medical community, not least of which through scientific publications and presentations at particular conferences. I would say that what's of interest here is that we're not looking at developing a drug that restricts children. We're looking at a drug that enables children. And as I say, to hit those core domains as we have in this first phase 2/3 trial in 54 kids, I think is pretty remarkable. Let's wait and see. Certainly from the company's perspective, we tend not to focus on running commentary as to what we may do corporately. But I think as some on the call who've known me present or seen me present know, I'm unashamedly a fan of Neuron's strategy, and I'm unashamedly a fan of a company called GW Pharmaceuticals, which was subsequently acquired by Jazz Pharmaceuticals in 2021, I think. So that's probably where I'll leave it.
No problem. The next question is, with regards to funding, are you expecting another R&D rebate this year? And this combined with the capital raise, how long do you expect the funds to last?
Yep. So we have been very successful because we have a lot of activity in Australia in eliciting the R&D tax incentive from the Australian government. So last year, I think our gross spend was 6.5 in R&D. Memory serves me correctly, we got back 3.2 million as an R&D tax incentive in November. So again, this year, you've seen the half-year commit. There'll be further R&D this half. We've now, as I've talked about in the past, we've now essentially completed the trials we raised money for back in 2022. The cash balance of 4.5 million at 31 December, because I get this question a lot about, was the money supposed to last for all of what you were doing historically in a clinical sense? The answer is yes. We have 4.5 million as at December, and we still have cerebral palsy, which is a study less than $1 million to look at. So yeah, the rhyme and reason for that initial raise has held true. We've been careful guardians of capital, and we make that capital last. So if I can give the questioner a step-up answer without providing cash flow guidance, the step-up number is as follows. So you saw our pro forma number was 15.5. You've seen our use of funds. We are directing those funds to what we need to do in autism and what we need to do for Rett and PANS as a next step, data dependent for Rett. What we also have is 65 million listed options with an exercise price of 13.5 cents that expire in January. That's potentially an additional source of funds for the company of around $8 to $9 million. And so if you add that on top of the 15.5 and the set off being the R&D tax incentive, we are very well funded, and we are very well funded for what I would consider in biotech sense a very long time. And it's our job as guardians of that capital to make sure that every dollar we spend sees a return, and the return is more drug product, regulatory decisions that allow us to commercially develop this drug, and importantly, further clinical data as required, and regulatory lever access through the Orphan Drug Designation Scheme, which most on the call will now know that it confers 7 years market exclusivity in the United States and 10 years in Europe. So we are well funded. Great position to be in given the geopolitical climate.
Very good. The next question is, given your very broad experience, how would you rate the success of today's trial in the context of some of the better results that you've seen?
In my experience, having looked at companies in the sector and been part of some pretty successful ones over the years, with respect to autism, with Rett, we've still got more data to come. This is one of the cleanest, best clinical data sets I've seen where a drug can have such a profound difference after just 8 weeks of therapy. So that is across both those clinician assessments, the more comprehensive Vineland adaptive measure assessment, and the comprehensive social responsiveness assessment. To be able to hit all of those in 54 patients across 8 weeks of therapy with no placebo effect and good baseline balance between the two arms, that is a very, very strong data set. And yeah, haven't seen one like that for a while. So pretty pleased to be part of it, to be honest.
The next question I have is, in the face of these results, will Neurotech now lobby the government to include funding to companies like Neurotech to assist them in getting treatments like NTI 164 to market as an additional pillar to the draft autism strategy that the government outlined recently?
Absolutely. So that draft autism strategy is a very comprehensive document that provides a great deal of comfort to autistic patients and their caregivers. But I guess from my perspective, I don't think it's really addressed what is the elephant in the room here, and that is we need better therapies. We need better therapies that are safe, because the overarching treatment goal here is to improve these adaptive behaviours, to improve these children's well-being. And whilst the strategy talks a lot about how to do that, it doesn't really talk about the dire unmet medical need here for a safe, effective therapy on adaptive behaviours, the severity of illness, and one that actually improves the child. And so the NDIS, to be clear, does not regulate drugs, does not pay for drugs, does not prescribe a price for drugs. That is the Therapeutic Goods Administration, that is the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, who direct the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. So naturally, from the perspective of Neurotech with this data, what we need to do here, with the advice of the TGA, whether that involves some form of expedited provisional registration, whether they wish to see another trial in ASD, is to be determined. But certainly one of the things we're very interested in, and we're spending not unreasonable, we're spending a little bit of money on, and that is determining what is the economic impact on these children when they receive NTI 164. So the economic impact on our trials as it relates to, does the child return to school? If so, does he or she attend full-time? Does he or she therefore require less occupational support services? Does he or she have less parental oversight or caregiver oversight? And if you think about that in purely economic terms, that reduces the cost burden or cost impost on the support services. On an intangible, it means the parent then goes back to work, potentially, or both of them go back to work, and therefore they become an Australian taxpayer, and therefore tax dollars come in because they're now able to go back to work knowing that their child, he or she, is in a very safe pair of hands because he or she has moved from, say, markedly to severely ill down to a more mild state, which is transformational for that kind of behaviour. And overlaying that with their communication, their socialisation, living more independently, that's exactly, as I said at the start, that's exactly what a parent wants to see. So our job from here is to work with the TGA, to work with government, to see that this intervention is priced appropriately, is absolutely reimbursed, because we see that it is likely to be a very cost-effective intervention relative to the severity of autism spectrum disorder in Australia for those children with level 2 and 3 classifications.
Thank you. Are there any plans to license sales of NTI 164 in the US and Europe to A, speed up commercialisation, and B, reduce risk for Neurotech?
That's a good question. So if you look at the Australian market, autism, it is much higher than this, but I'm just giving you a referenceable fact. There's 230,000 currently on the NDIS that are the same classifications of patients we treat. For Rett, there's 200 girls. For pandas, we think there's about 800 boys and girls in Australia, so both rare. That's a pretty good market at the end of the day. In pharmaceutical terms, particularly for Rett and PANS, it's probably not worth them worrying about necessarily, but for us as a microcap developer, that's reasonably important. We manufacture the drug ourselves, and we support now close to 100 children. and we will support them forever. So these children are, in every respect, our biggest advocates. Ultimately, they are receiving NTI 164 because their parents were, and the paediatric neurologists were willing to have them be part of a scientific experiment. So for that, they get rewarded with NTI 164 as long as they want to be on it. However, if you look in America, just on autism, Rett, PANS, we're looking at 3 million autistic patients, prevalence pool of up to 15,000 in the United States for Rett and perhaps 8,000 for PANS, 8 to 10,000. So it's well beyond our balance sheet to do that from day one or day 365. I won't answer the question directly because we don't provide running commentary. However, I did say that from a strategic perspective, my favorite company is Neuren and GW, and that's exactly the pathway that those two companies went down, albeit in GW's case, they were acquired. In Neuren's case, they partnered. So I would love nothing more than for a party or parties to defray the financial risk and the time effect to accelerate this treatment and get it in the hands of as many needy patients as possible.
Thank you. There's been a couple of questions around the expected timeframe to hear back from the TGA regarding approval for NTI 164 and potential go-to-market. What can you say on that front?
It's always a process. It's a difficult one to range bound necessarily, but it's hypothetically driven because we haven't had the meeting. When we have the minutes of the meeting from the TGA, we will share those with investors. So depending on the timeline of those meetings, they certainly start later this month. The turnaround on the constructive or otherwise nature of the meeting is pretty quick. In terms of the pathways, again, it's a hypothetical consideration here, but again, as I mentioned, the TGA may require a replication of this first trial to satisfy their requirement of 2 well-designed double-blind placebo-controlled trials in autism. That would be an inexpensive exercise well within our use of funds. It would also recruit incredibly quickly, given what we've just shown today. But as I mentioned, there is also an opportunity potentially for provisional registration, which is around about a 12 to 18-month process. If, as a company with our advisors, we are satisfied that we have a sporting chance of getting a provisional registration based on either the quality of our data set or the encouragement potentially of the TGA to look at that route.
The next question I have is, can you see NTI 164 potentially being used in combination with DAYBUE for Rett syndrome?
I absolutely see that as potentially an opportunity for both companies at the end of the day. DAYBUE, with its US FDA registration, with the clinician support it has, is a standard of care. So it is the first and only standard of care. So typically in medicine, a doctor ethically treating must offer the standard of care if the rule book, which is the rule book being the consensus treatment guidelines, says that he or she must at least offer that treatment for those patients. So for us, the interesting facet here is if we were to run a trial in the United States, the question is, would that be a combination study with DAYBUE, where we could potentiate the improvements they've seen in Rett syndrome behavioural questionnaire, RSBQ, and CGI-I, clinical improvement. Do both therapies potentiate each other? Don't know the answer to that. We're certainly different compounds. There are synthetic terminal tripeptide of insulin-like growth factor 1 from memory, going back a few years. And so very strong neuroprotective effects, some anti-neuroinflammation. I feel that we hit neuroinflammation, really strongly. So, using my scientific training, I would say that it makes sense in combination potentially. The other alternative for us is for girls who have either failed treatment or have elected to discontinue treatment on DAYBUE, we could potentially look at a study there, which would mean that we would be what's called a second line treatment intervention. But as I say, as a company, we have not committed to that at all. This is just a hypothetical answer to a very well-constructed question.
Thank you.
And it pertains to the United States as well. DAYBUE is not approved in Europe currently. Arcadia, it's fair to say, and Neuron have an aim to be registered through the EMA as they do in Japan, and it's not approved as we speak today in Australia either.
The next question I have is, can you please confirm what the CGI-I score in Rett was at 12 weeks?
No, I can't. That data will be coming in the next 2 to 4 weeks. So we've reported the mean difference. What investors will have to wait for is the fulsome analysis of that primary endpoint, which relates to the actual score they received. And I think in Neuron's case, I can't remember, it was on one of the slides, but the shift was obviously 0.3. So I guess it's a reasonable question. Is our shift similar to a baseline of Neuron or not? The answer is we don't know, and we're analysing all of that currently, and it'll be available with the other secondaries in 2 weeks or 2 to 4 weeks.
The next question is, could you advise with the ASD data as to whether the CGI-I and CGI-S scores were anchored or not to specific symptoms for ASD?
Just repeat that one.
Can you advise on your ASD data whether the CGI-I and CGI-S scores were anchored or not to symptoms specific to ASD?
I think I understand the question, which is, were they designed were they a generic type read, or were they a battery that was designed for or used for autistic patients? I'll have to take that one on notice. Certainly for CGI-I, it's the clinician's treatment experience in autism that's important. So he or she is an expert in what creates the difference from the drug therapy versus the placebo. I'm going to say the same thing holds true for autism, and it was a standard CGI-S test as it was a standard CGI-I test. But I just need to go back and look at the study protocol in a little more detail. It's a pretty precise question, but thank you for the audience member who asked it. If they want to email me so I have their details, I'll see if I can find that out for them.
Thank you. The next one is there any reason there was a lack of placebo response in the ASD trials, and why such a large number of patients worsened in the placebo arm in 8 weeks?
Patients did not worsen in the placebo arm at 8 weeks. Patients were stable in the placebo arm for both CGI-S and CGI-I. Sorry, I see where the question is. For CGI-S, yes, placebo was stable. For CGI-I on the mean, there was no change either, but there were 38% of CGI-I placebo children who just showed some minimal improvement. There's no rhyme or reason, at least for the primary endpoint CGI-S, as to why placebo stayed the same, except to say that's exactly what you want to see from a trial where autism generally has a placebo effect, and the way we conditioned against the placebo effect is to obviously use as the primary endpoint CGI-S, which is a clinician administered assessment. It's not a caregiver or patient self-assessment. And so there's a level of objectivity, much more so than potentially a patient or a parent. So that for me is really interesting data, because I think some investors have queried, potentially rightfully so, is there a long-term durable placebo effect from the open label work you've done? My strong comeback there these days is, well, if you are going to see a placebo effect in these measures in an unblinded sense, which was our first trial, you may see that in the first 4 weeks, but we've shown continued improvement not only across CGI-S from 8 weeks to week 32, and then 52 weeks, and then 90 weeks for safety. it's very hard to game consistently CGIS, because it's the clinician giving it, not the patient. And also for Vineland, that very much more comprehensive assessment, a child caregiver will not be able to consistently beat the test and retest validity of that measure. So I think I've answered the question, but overall, I'll just make the comment that the doctors and their staff who administered CGIS and CGI-I have shown us that overall there was no change to placebo in those scores between day 0 and week 8.
Thanks, Tom. We'll leave it there in terms of the questions. There is a couple outstanding, but just in the interest of time, we'll wrap up. So I just want to hand it back to you to give a concluding comment.
Look, if they're easy to answer and I'm not too verbose, Matt. I'm happy to have a crack at them now quickly, and then I'll wrap up once I've answered the second one, if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem. So, 2 final questions. Have you had any dialogue with the FDA regarding the clinical trial design for ASD, use of a single trial site, and whether there is a plan for IND opening and timeline for that?
So the short answer is yes. We've had an initial discussion with the FDA around a year and a half ago, which was basically around the requirements as they see it for a registration of an autistic disorder treatment in the United States. And as you'd not be surprised to hear, given ASD is not an orphan disease, 2 well-designed phase 3 clinical trials, which demonstrates statistical significance and tolerable safety, is what you need to do. Have we met with the FDA on other programs, Rett and PANS? No. Are we intending to put a package together with the FDA and the EMA for both of those? The answer is yes. Was there another bit to that question I think I may have missed? Or did I capture it?
Just around the IND.
So the answer, yeah. So from an IND perspective with autism, not yet, because we're assiduously following the Australian TGA to see where that lands. Certainly the aim is to develop the toxicology pack that the FDA and arguably the EMA and ultimately TGA may want to see, is what we're doing now, with the goal of securing an IND for either Rett or PANS or both.
And use of a single site.
Yeah, so for purposes of a larger trial, as it relates to, say, the United States for autism or indeed others, yes, multi-centre trials would be on the cards, only because the ability to recruit is maybe a bit quicker. Having said that, in autism in Australia, we're not going to be staffed of potential patients who want to join the trial.
That last question was just what pricing could be achieved for the ADS treatment in Australia, do you think?
I can't answer that directly. I can only give you some indirect answers, if that's okay. So the reason being that pricing is an exceedingly confidential process between the drug sponsor, in our case Neurotech, it is Neurotech, and the government. There is an approved treatment. It's a only FDA approved CBD oil for 2 rare epileptic disorders in Australia, and it's approved in the US and Europe. It's on track to do $1 billion US, mind you, which is why we love orphan diseases generally. And that treatment is called Epidiolex. And so Epidiolex, in the Australian context, I've had it on slides in the past, is priced around $23,000 annually. I'm not wedded to that number. It's just to give you some context that a CBD product, which we're not, but this is pure CBD. We are a constituent of CBDA and some other cannabinoids. That product has a threshold to pay of $23,000, give or take, a year in Australia. A bit higher in the US, but that's just for those 2 epileptic disorders. Then you look at Rett syndrome, just to round that off. The way DAYBUE is priced in the United States is $1,000 US a day. That is an intervention that has shown a statistically significant and clinically meaningful difference in CGI-I and RSBQ, with, in the FDA's view, manageable side effects. They were approved and they've received reimbursement at or around that level, which sounds very significant to most on this call, but it highlights to myself and others who follow orphan drugs, and that being the threshold to pay is far higher to reward developers who take the time and effort and spend the money in rare diseases, particularly for children. Matt, I'll take that as the last. So I'd just like to thank everyone. I'm sorry we've gone 5 minutes over the hour. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to send them to me. I'm always responsive, albeit not immediately sometimes, but I just want to round out by thanking certainly Professor Fay and the work to continue with Associate Professor Ellaway on what they've done for us, and just how important it is for NTI 164 to be used in these children and to be developed for these children, where I'm sure people who have an autistic child or Rett syndrome child will appreciate is potentially life-changing for them and life-changing for their children. So thanks, Matt. Appreciate the call, and have a good afternoon, everyone. See you later.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to everyone for joining.